The Villisca Axe Murders. On the evening of June 9, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, was just like any other quiet American town. With a population of only around 1,300 people, almost everyone knew each other. Families left their doors unlocked, children played outside until sunset, and violent crime was almost unheard of. That night, the Moore family returned home after attending a church event. Josiah Moore, his wife Sarah, their four children, and two young sisters who had been invited for a sleepover, all went to bed, expecting the next day to be completely ordinary. But no one inside that house would ever wake up. The following morning, a concerned neighbor noticed that something felt unusual. The Moore family had not started their daily routine, and the house remained strangely quiet. When she entered the home to check on them, she was met with a scene so horrifying that it would shock the entire country. All 8 people inside the house had been brutally murdered with an axe while they were asleep. The crime scene raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer either entered through an unlocked door or was somehow allowed inside. Even more disturbing was the fact that investigators believed the murderer had remained inside the house for hours after the killings. The curtains had been carefully pulled shut to block anyone from seeing inside. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloth, and even a plate of food was found sitting on the kitchen table, leading investigators to believe that the killer may have calmly eaten before leaving. Police immediately launched one of the largest investigations of its time. Dozens of suspects were questioned, and several men were arrested over the following years. One suspect even confessed to the murders, but later admitted that the confession was completely false. Another man stood trial, yet the jury failed to reach a unanimous verdict, and he was eventually released. As time passed, every lead went cold. No murder weapon linked to a suspect, no eyewitness, no convincing motive. Despite years of investigation, no one was ever convicted for the massacre. More than a century later, the Villisca Axe murders remain one of the oldest unsolved murder cases in American history. 2. The Springfield Three. On the night of June 6, 1992, two best friends, Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall, celebrated their high school graduation in Springfield, Missouri. After attending several graduation parties, they decided to spend the night at Susie's house instead of driving home. Waiting for them, there was Susie's mother, Cheryl Levitt. Nothing about that night seemed unusual. The three women arrived home safely, and by all accounts, everything appeared completely normal. The next morning, friends arrived at the house to pick up Susie and Stacy for another graduation celebration. As soon as they walked inside, they noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked, but the house didn't look like the scene of a crime. The television was still on. The women's purses were neatly arranged inside the house. Their money, cigarettes, makeup, and even their car keys had all been left behind. Susie's dog was wandering around the house, calm and unharmed. At first, it seemed as though the women had simply stepped out for a few minutes, but they never came back. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no blood, no obvious evidence of a struggle. It looked as if 3 adults had simply vanished into thin air. Investigators searched the house from top to bottom, hoping to find even the smallest clue. Instead, they found almost nothing. One detail that still frustrates investigators today involves the glass from the porch light. Someone had noticed the light was broken and, without realizing the house might be a crime scene, cleaned up the shattered glass before police could examine it. If the killer had left fingerprints or DNA there, that evidence was gone forever. Over the years, police received thousands of tips. Some people claimed they had seen the women after they disappeared. Others believed they had been kidnapped by a serial offender. Several suspects were investigated, but none of the evidence was strong enough to solve the case. More than 3 decades have passed, and no trace of Susie Streeter, Stacy McCall, or Cheryl Levitt has ever been found. No bodies have been recovered, no arrests have been made, and no one knows exactly what happened inside that quiet suburban home. To this day, the disappearance of the Springfield Three remains one of the most baffling missing person cases in American history. 3 women entered that house on an ordinary summer night. And somehow, they disappeared without leaving behind a single answer. 3. The Ketty Cabin Murders. On the night of April 11, 1981, the quiet mountain community of Ketty, California, was the last place anyone expected a brutal crime to take place. It was a peaceful town where neighbors knew one another, and most people never imagined they would become part of one of America's most disturbing unsolved murder mysteries. That evening, 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp was at home in cabin 28 with several of her children. It was an ordinary Friday night. Some of the kids were watching television, others had gone to bed, and nothing suggested that the family was in danger. The next morning, Sue's 14-year-old daughter Sheila returned home after spending the night at a friend's house. As she walked inside cabin 28, she was met with a scene so horrifying that investigators would never forget it. Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son John, and John's 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate had all been brutally murdered. The crime scene showed clear signs of extreme violence, and investigators believed the victims had fought desperately to survive. But one detail made the case even stranger. In another bedroom of the same cabin, 3 younger children had been sleeping the entire night. Remarkably, they were completely unharmed. Even more shocking, the killer had apparently left the room without disturbing them. Investigators searched the cabin and recovered several pieces of physical evidence, including fingerprints, footprints, and what appeared to be the murder weapons. Unlike many unsolved cases, this wasn't a crime scene with no clues. In fact, police believed they had enough evidence to identify the people responsible. Over the years, several suspects emerged. Witness statements, anonymous tips, and newly discovered evidence pointed toward multiple possible killers. At one point, investigators even found a letter that appeared to describe details of the murders that had never been released to the public. Despite all of this, no one was ever convicted. As the years passed, mistakes made during the original investigation, lost evidence, and conflicting witness accounts made solving the case even more difficult. 4. The Yogurt Shop Murders. On the night of December 6, 1991, 4 teenage girls were working the closing shift at an "I can't believe it's yogurt" shop in Austin, Texas. It was supposed to be an ordinary Friday night. Customers came and went. The girls laughed with each other as they cleaned the store, and within a short time, they were expected to lock the doors and go home. But they never did. Just after midnight, firefighters responded to reports of a fire at the yogurt shop. At first, they believed it was simply a small commercial fire. However, once the flames were brought under control, they discovered something far more horrifying. Inside the burned building were the bodies of all 4 girls. Investigators quickly determined that the fire had been deliberately set in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. The victims had also been bound before they were killed, making it clear that this was not a random act of violence. The crime shocked the entire country. Austin had never seen anything like it, and police launched one of the largest investigations in the city's history. Thousands of tips poured in from across the United States. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people and followed countless leads, hoping that someone had seen or heard something that night. Years later, 4 men were arrested after giving confessions during lengthy police interrogations. At first, it seemed the mystery had finally been solved. But there was a problem. The confessions didn't match the physical evidence. Some of the details were inconsistent with what investigators knew had happened inside the store. As forensic technology improved, DNA testing failed to connect the suspects to the crime scene. Eventually, the convictions were overturned and all charges were dismissed. Once again, the investigation returned to where it had started. No confirmed suspects, no convictions, and no clear explanation for who committed one of the most horrifying crimes in Texas history. More than 3 decades later, detectives continue to review evidence using modern forensic techniques, hoping advances in technology might finally reveal the killer's identity. 5. The Zodiac Killer. In the late 1960s, Northern California was gripped by fear as a mysterious serial killer began targeting young couples in isolated areas. But what made this case different wasn't just the murders. It was what happened afterward. Instead of hiding from the police, the killer wanted the world to know he existed. Shortly after the attacks, local newspapers began receiving handwritten letters from someone claiming responsibility for the murders. Inside those letters were chilling details that had never been released to the public, convincing investigators that the writer was almost certainly the killer. He gave himself a name that would become infamous around the world: the Zodiac. But the letters didn't stop there. The Zodiac began sending cryptic ciphers filled with strange symbols, challenging newspapers to publish them on their front pages. He claimed that if anyone could solve the codes, they would discover his true identity. Some of the ciphers were eventually cracked, Others remained unsolved for decades. One of them still hasn't been completely deciphered. As the investigation grew, thousands of suspects were questioned. Police collected fingerprints, handwriting samples, witness statements, and physical evidence from multiple crime scenes. Several suspects appeared promising, but every time investigators believed they were getting closer, the evidence fell apart. Perhaps the most frustrating part of the case is that the Zodiac seemed to enjoy playing games with investigators. In several letters, he openly mocked the police, claiming they would never catch him. He even hinted that he had committed more murders than authorities knew about, although many of those claims could never be verified. Over the years, advances in DNA technology and forensic science have allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected decades ago. New suspects have continued to emerge, and amateur investigators have proposed countless theories about the killer's identity. But despite more than 50 years of investigation, no court has ever convicted anyone for the Zodiac murders.